Hello, everyone. I'm Rohit Muzumdar. I teach at the School of Environment and Architecture. Along with the monsoon, I extend a welcome to each one of you to join in imagining the monsoon as method with Lindsay Bremner as a part of Sea Conversations 2022, titled Drawing Out Natures. Imaginations invent worlds and also how we come to understand them by constructing realities based on specific ways of seeing, listening, and sensing. Drawing out natures is an engagement towards making visible the invisible relationship between natures and natures of human and more than human agency. In this series of Sea Conversations, we delve into the drawing out of natures to advance imaginaries of engagement with contemporary ecological crises and climate emergencies, and the contests that come to erode and expand on socio-spatial claims in the shared ecologies of our worlds. This online lecture series has been co-curated and supported by the Shared Ecologies program of the Shama Foundation, along with the ongoing support of Urban Center Mumbai. So welcome all of you. I extend a warm welcome to Professor Lindsay Bremner. Thank you for joining us and accepting our invite. Professor Lindsay Bremner is a research architect and educator at the University of Westminster in London, where she is Director of Research in the School of Architecture and Cities. She recently held a European Research Council grant for Monsoon Assemblages, a project exploring 3 Bay of Bengal cities, Chennai, Dhaka, and Yangon, as monsoonal assemblages being disrupted and transformed by globalisation and climate change. She holds a Bachelor's of Architecture degree from the University of Cape Town and Masters of Architecture and DSc.Arch from the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg. Professor Lindsay Bremner's presentation will think through what it means to reframe spatial research around the monsoon and to approach cities and monsoon assemblages of weather worlds. It will challenge ways of thinking cities and climate, or society and nature, as separate entities stacked up against one another, instead exploring the multiple ways they are entangled and co-produced. So welcome again, Professor Lindsay Bremner. I'll hand this over to you to start. I'll be switching off my camera, and in case you need me, just let me know.
Okay, thank you so much, Rohit, and thank you to the School of Environment and Architecture for this wonderful opportunity to speak with you today. I'm sorry for the slight delay, but I was having a few connection problems, which hopefully will not occur again. So let me start by sharing my screen. And if Rohit, if you could just tell me if this is working.
Yes, it is working. So
it is working. Fantastic. Okay, so let me just put it on and then we can start. Great. Okay. Today I'm going to present some work that I and a small team at the University of Westminster in London produced between 2016 and 2021 as part of the project that Rohit has already introduced called Monsoon Assemblages. The research collective for this project comprised myself, I'm an architect, Beth Cullen, an anthropologist, Christina Geros, a landscape architect, and John Cook, an architect, with PhD researchers Anthony Powis, an architect, we were 3 architects as part of this team, and Harshavardhan Bhatt, a political scientist. We also had input from many students and collaborators in the places that we worked in. The presentation will think through what it means to reimagine cities as weather worlds, beginning with the monsoon, which is a weather system that envelops the globe. It will challenge ways of thinking, cities and climate, society and planet as separate entities, instead exploring the multiple ways they are entangled and co-produced. But before I do this, I thought I'd go back to when I first started to think and understand cities as part of the Earth's complex systems. It was in Johannesburg, the city I lived and worked in for many years, which is located where it is because it is where the world's richest underground seam of gold reaches the surface. This map is actually of the Witwatersrand gold fields, which extend in a sort of 56-kilometer long ridge running east to west across the landscape. This is not only where gold was deposited in underground seams by alluvial processes, in other words, by water many millennia ago, and also structured apartheid planning. The map on the right is a sort of figure ground of the city with the large blank swathe along the middle where the gold seam surfaces and which divided the white city to the north and the black city to the south. It is also where this ridge is also the watershed between the Indian and the Atlantic Oceans. In other words, Johannesburg registers not only the time of human stories founded on the extraction of gold, but also the deep time of geology and the ongoing cycle of meteorological and hydrological flows. In 2005, I was asked to participate in the Rotterdam Architecture Biennale, whose theme that year was Mare Nostrum, our sea. I presented work on Durban, a city on the eastern shore of South Africa, as a city shaped by the ocean. And this inaugurated a new research focus for me on the Indian Ocean that I called Folded Ocean. This project reimagined cities as oceanic territories being transformed by globalization and climate change, producing what I called a bioptic chart of the ocean through which to navigate these troubled waters. By focusing primarily on exemplary sites in Lamu in Kenya, a small island in the Bengal Delta, the Maldives, and the southern Indian Ocean. Folded Ocean made me aware of the significance of the monsoon to the Indian Ocean world, something that you are all no stranger to at all. And in 2015, I applied to the European Research Council for this project to investigate how 3 cities on the Bay of Bengal, Chennai, Dhaka, and Yangon, were shaped by the monsoon and being transformed once again by globalization and climate change. And this is the ongoing theme that runs through this work. Monsoon Assemblages, the project that resulted, took issue with the idea that is deeply embedded within climate science and the popular imaginary that society and climate are separate bounded domains stacked up against one another. This attitude was expressed by Bishop Desmond Tutu at COP20 in 2014, when he said, "We fought apartheid, now climate change is our global enemy." Such ideas are complicit with what Bruno Latour calls the modern scientific constitution, a knowledge system grounded in binaries, and the assumption of objective access to a measurable externalized nature. In other words, nature is something that we are distanced from and access through measuring it as something objective and external to us. Postmodern theorists took issue with this idea, but they argued that while there might be an external reality, human relations with it are constituted entirely through science, language in particular, and that what is real for humans are sign systems. In other words, the external world is a construct of how we represent it to ourselves. This foreclosed access to the material world except in the languages of science, economics, or culture, Foucault's life, labor, and language, through which external reality was brought into the realm of human intelligibility and mastery. Counter to these two approaches, Monsoon Assemblages drew from feminist and science and technology scholarship to recognize the monsoon not only as an object of science and a discursive construct, but also a subject of world making. It is a noteworthy actor in the world, not in a positivist, human-centric way, but as an elusive, active, more than human other. We responded to Elizabeth Gross's call to think through rather than about the earth and what it means to afford political power to the elemental forcefulness of the earth itself. This video is a video we took driving through the Himalayas, which shows the impact of the weather on the kind of earth itself and the kind of ongoing animation of Earth's materiality by weather systems. At times nurturing, at times recalcitrant, at times overwhelming, the monsoon follows logics that have little, if anything, to do what humans make of it, think of it, or do with it. It is a restless material multiplicity, interacting within itself and the human and non-human bodies and practices that respond to and shape it from within in countless, divergent, and unpredictable ways. Our method, which we called Monsoon as method, was a way of thinking with and attuning to the monsoon's agential materiality and with its ongoing transformative power as it interacts with human and non-human bodies and practices. If we are going to figure out what to do about climate change and give meaning to the idea of climate justice, we have to put weather at the center of our approach to cities. British geographer Mike Hume, in his amazing book, Weathered: Cultures of Climate, argues that climate is an idea, a story we tell ourselves to make sense of the world in which we live. It might be backed up by data, but it is essentially a way that humans interpret and make sense of changing weather over time, and the cultural ways of living through which they have adapted to it. The World Meteorological Society's definition of climate is a statistical description of averages and the variability of variables like temperature, humidity, etc. Climate modelers see climate as a way of describing the state and dynamics of the planetary system. But, Hume argues, these symbolic interactions between weather and cultures. These descriptions do not do justice to the material and symbolic interactions between weather and cultures and perpetuate a nature-culture binary. He approaches climate not through statistics, which actually was only possible since the 17th century, but through the way that people experience weather and the knowledge systems, rituals, practices that they create to understand and live in it. In other words, as their weather worlds. In our work, the idea of assemblage became a tool for exploring such weather worlds. The notion of assemblage comes from the French word agencement, which means the arrangement, layout, or fitting together of parts. The word was brought into contemporary theory by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. Assemblages are not stable wholes because they are not a simple sum of their parts, but rather of parts and the interactions or liaisons between them, such as the parts of this carriage, which is a drawing that comes from one of Deleuze and Guattari's books. Each of these parts maintains an energetic pulse slightly off that of their relations, making assemblages radically open-ended and emergence. Monsoon assemblages, then, are multiple and lively human and more than human entanglements with weather, in which technologies, materials, and various life forms assemble in concrete, irreducible, emergent ways. I should have started this video a little bit earlier, sorry. The idea of assemblage then enabled us to distance our work from British historian Rhodes Murphy's construct of monsoon Asia, which he used to define a unit of study of Asia. Murphy's monsoon Asia was a more or less rigid container defined by geographic boundaries, in which rainfall had produced population densities and cultures with common features. But, going with Deleuze and Guattari, unities are deceptions designed to obscure rather than reveal the nature of reality. I'm going to go back here. Along with other geographical units, such as the Middle East or Sub-Saharan Africa, Monsoon Asia is a remnant of a European epistemological spatial structure that organizes knowledge of the world in rigid categories as they appear from the colonial center, reinforcing fantasies of otherness, power, dominance, and peripherality. The monsoon, in our monsoonal method, was not a signifier of otherness, but a multi-positional method that moved from outside to inside, pushed the global positionality of science up against the situated knowledge of everyday experience, and changed the monsoon itself from being an object of study into a forceful subject of world-making. It was an attempt to mobilize the monsoon to think with, to develop new methods of research with, to generate new concepts with, and to make new drawings with. We use two primary methods of research to do this work, cartography and ethnography, while being aware that both of them were stained by the legacies of colonialism and the part they played in projects of empire around the world. One of the key questions that guided monsoon assemblages was how to conceive and grasp the monsoon through drawing. We were, for the most part, a group of architects, after all. Unfurling the monsoon visually as a story of interdependent and interpenetrating natures was one of the most challenging and rewarding parts of the project. It provided a way of working out new paradigms and new imaginaries for architecture and landscape design. Our drawings were conceptualized as arguments to instigate ways of thinking with rather than thinking about the monsoon, and to bring it to life as a volumetric weather world. This meant departing from the well-settled analytical conventions of architectural drawing, namely orthographic projection and perspective, which were not up to the task of depicting the voluminous dynamic materiality of the monsoon. Neither were the cartographic techniques used by landscape architects since the 1960s, and those are the drawings on the kind of lower right of the screen, which layer social and physical data onto one another as if they can be separated out. Constituting the monsoon through drawing required liberating both from topographic layers and human-centeredness in order to depict its planetary scope alongside local inflections, intensities, volumes, cycles, and rhythms. Our drawings began as pixels radioed from outer space. This is a drawing we did of all the satellites that were used to generate the data that we used in our drawings. It's a drawing of the globe centered around Chennai, but shows the multiple kind of layers of satellite activity which generate climate data. So they generate as pixels from outer space. We then assembled them into lists of numerical data culled from various access platforms and sorted into columns and rows on spreadsheets, imported through a graphical parametric tool called Grasshopper into Rhinoceros 3D to transform them into spatial data, and then we tuned our maps aesthetically in Adobe software. It's important to note that these maps do not represent physical reality, but rather the data they were constructed from and the protocols used to process them. This is one of our maps actually of the northeastern monsoon, in which we layered the map with all the instruments of observation that were used to construct it. And the sort of stripes across the map show the paths of the satellite, the paths that satellite data covers. And you can see the kind of glitches and empty spaces in between. So data is not ubiquitous across the planet, in other words. So the maps question the information provided by science by incorporating the glitches and inconsistencies of data, and by coupling it with other more fuzzy data, such as that traced from images in scientific reports. Our drawings then are not transcendent to the world, nor a mirror to material processes, but interlocutors that put the monsoon and its scientific infrastructure in question and in conversation with other ways of knowing. For all their cartographic detail, our drawings set up a resistance to being read empirically, instead offering the viewer an aesthetic experience of atmospheric qualities, tropospheric hazes, plateaus of intensity, and the monsoon's intra-elemental transcorporeality. This is actually a map of Chennai, showing that actually overlays topography with the topography of clouds at a certain moment. And it starts to become quite difficult to figure out whether you're looking at the Earth's topography or the topography of cloud volumes. Just a little, okay, that's another map. We also then spent quite some time drawing the cities we were working in as mobilized and analyzed by monsoonal agencies. This is a collection of images of Chennai, which we began to kind of read through the idea of the aerial monsoon, given that Chennai receives its rain from the air and from the Bay of Bengal, and quite sporadically. It's driven by aerial depressions. This is one of our drawings of Dhaka, which shows the kind of extension of the city through the pumping of silt from the rivers that are brought down by the monsoon each year in vast quantities. And this is a kind of way of constructing land on which urban development and property development then takes place. Highly problematic, but I won't have time to go into that today. And this is one of our drawings of Yangon in Myanmar, whose monsoon is driven by tectonic processes. And through understanding the tectonics of the region, we began to understand the kind of symbolic and ritual practices of a kind of country with incredibly rich minerals resources, because of its tectonic activity, which then also relates to the monsoon. Okay, the second method of research we used was ethnography. And here the work was really driven by Beth Cullen, the anthropologist who was part of our team. We took inspiration from two ethnographic methods to investigate the lived reality of the monsoon. The first was multi-sited, or follow the thing ethnography, which follows people, connections, materials, associations, and relationships across space and time. And this became used as a way of understanding trans-scalar, trans-temporal relationships in which the cities we were studying were caught up. This is a map of the mining and distribution of jade, which is a kind of extractive process which really has driven the Myanmar's economy for the past 50 years or so, and actually has resulted in the transformation of real estate in Yangon. But in order to understand real estate in Yangon, we had to follow jade back to its sources. This was also used in work that Beth did on Bangla bricks, okay, which traced the kind of Bangladesh brick industry back to sediments from the Himalayas. And this kind of exemplifies this approach. This allowed us to understand cities as material entities assembled within dynamics that extended way beyond their human delineated boundaries or temporal frameworks. The second ethnographic approach we used in our work was more than human ethnography. As Beth followed the life cycles of dragonflies, snakes, and hilsafish, we realized that they were tied to monsoonal cycles, and we learned things about the monsoon that we would otherwise not have been aware of, as well as the violence of human practices on the life worlds of other species. Through these methods, we built up new intersectional understandings of the intimate entanglements between weather, climate, and human and non-human knowledge systems and life worlds. At the same time, we became acutely aware of the history of research as a colonial encounter and of the extractive legacies and violence of the Western eye. Maori scholar Linda Tuhiwai-Smith reminded us that research is one of the ways in which the underlying code of imperialism, colonialism, and neocolonialism is both regulated and realized. We realized that we could not document and describe the monsoon from the outside, for our lives were wrapped up within it. We were the beneficiaries of a colonial order that had built its wealth on monsoonal extraction. This is a map of Madras drawn in the early 1920s, when British colonial practices and methods were imposed on what had otherwise been a kind of fluid, organic, monsoonal city. And we realized that we were the beneficiaries of this order that still had whose presence was still palpable in the India Office records in the British Library, in the edifices of empire on Exhibition Road in London, in Kew Garden, in the Palm House in Kew Gardens, in London's cuisine, and in the rise of India's elites to positions of power in British politics. In other words, the legacy of the monsoon was something that we ourselves were caught up in. And while colonial monsoonal legacies are a reminder of our interlinked pasts, the unfurling of neoliberal violence across monsoonal life worlds is a reminder of our interlinked futures. And interesting to note that the companies exploiting Chennai's IT incentives are companies like Amazon, Cognizant, and Verizon, and Indian companies, Tata Consultancy Services, Polaris, and Infosys, all of which has strong ties to the UK. Acknowledging these shared histories and interconnected geographies offered us a starting point for rethinking global collaboration, solidarity, and climate justice, and for connecting climate politics in the global north with climate politics in the global south. I'm going to just kind of shift emphasis for the last part of this talk to present two findings of our work that I think are probably relevant to architectural students and architectural scholars. And the first of those is the idea of dimension, something that we work with all the time. To note that the dimensions, and I've said this a few times, that the dimensions of the monsoon are volumetric. They're not 2D, they're not 3D, they're volumetric. And what does this actually mean? One version of volume, and the one that we architects usually use, and that underpins all our representational tools, is that volume equals three-dimensionality, based on a Cartesian understanding of space, x-axes, y-axes, and z-axes. The volumetricism of the monsoon questions this, for it is emergent and constantly changing, bringing together land, sea, and sky in situated places in ways that exceed the Cartesian grid and cannot be represented by it. The monsoon suggests that Cartesianism is only one way to conceive of dimension, by collapsing volume into 2D flatness and containing other more topological, relational, Lagrangian conceptions of dimension. The monsoon resists this and suggests an idea of dimension conceived in terms of what Jess Beer calls deep positionality. So dimension is not a point, in her work, dimension is not a point in a gridded Cartesian space, but a place enveloped in a life world of multiple dimensions and times, and also teleconnected across space and time. This is an image of the El Nino in 2015 in the Pacific Ocean, which was teleconnected to the floods that occurred in Chennai at December that year. And the monsoon draws attention to these multiple teleconnections across time and space, and that space cannot be contained in kind of zoomed in, zoomed out envelopes. The monsoonal dimensionality is rather an entanglement of scales and matters, rhythms and times, imaginaries and lived practices that intersect and interfere with Cartesian dimensions. The monsoon taught us to think about architecture as weather work, where weather is both the condition of heat, dryness, sunshine, cloudiness, wind and rain, etc., that reshapes and also that it constantly reshapes, and also at the same time, the total climate of social, political, and cultural existence in which we dwell. Secondly, I want to just cover very briefly the idea of time. So dimension and time are the two things I'm going to concentrate on today. The idea of regular, quantified, and linear time is a very modern invention associated with colonialism and largely a political technology of the body, a way to organize and control labor and logistical flows around the world. Time zones were only laid out in 1883, and universal time only adopted in 1972. And this story is linked to a story of progress and development. However, the monsoon operates according to a non-linear temporal modality. It is cyclical and rhythmic. It recurs and cycles back on itself. And in fact, a lot of our research involved the drawing of calendars in order to understand the kind of different cycles and the meaning of the monsoonal cycles in different contexts. In the monsoon, time is never past. The past is never past, but ever present. In other words, the kind of ancient system, geological systems that forced up the Himalayas and continue to do so, is present in every monsoonal cycle. Monsoonal time is both chronological and circular, one moment following the next, but time also cycling back on itself. In it, the deep time of the planet's history, recurring planetary rhythms and flows, and the time of human history and everyday life mutually interfere with one another. Just got two examples of this. Because of the cyclical withdrawing and coming back of the monsoon, cities are constantly in flux. These are two images of tanks in Chennai. I mean, this is very familiar with people who live in India. House constructions that are sort of 3 foot in the air for half the year, but then almost submerged in water the other half of the year. So there's a sort of cyclical and expanding and contracting nature of that monsoonal time kind of puts on human existence. Another drawing of brick fields in Bangladesh, which in the dry season is when bricks are made, in the wet season they're underwater, and life starts to take on this kind of rhythmic quality. This makes monsoonal time not linear and progressive, but cyclical and uncertain, inviting us to embrace the possibilities and the opportunities of living with uncertainty. The monsoon provides an uncertain ground from which to weave new forms of knowledge. And finally, I mean, so that was Monsoon Assemblages. I thought I'd just mention very briefly that we were very conscious in this project that our work was quite theoretical and abstract and never really touched the ground. And I've now had having the opportunity to work further with these ideas in a new British Academy funded project that I now have, to look at a creek in North Chennai called Ennor Creek, which is sort of being contaminated because it's the site of fly ash dumping from the power stations that are powering Chennai's IT economy, and to really start to look at our methodologies in a very, very specific site, along with NGO colleagues and other scholars, historians and anthropologists in a particular locale, in order to look at the possibilities of co-designing and a kind of restitutive plan and strategy for this highly contaminated creek. And that's it. I thought I'd just end with an image of our new book, which is out. It's called Monsoon as Methods. And I am told by the publisher, it's published in Barcelona, that there will be an Indian distributor who will provide the books, hopefully at a far cheaper price than people in India are able to get it from Barcelona. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. That was a really rich presentation and talk. Brought out several important kind of things. I'll kind of, three things that I take away from this lectures, kind of reiterate those to start off this conversation. Your idea of assemblages as being dynamic, monsoonal assemblages being very dynamic, change fundamentally the ways in which space has been drawn in mechanical ways through ideas of zoning. And in relationality, the ideas of zones change. And if you could, if this relationality between society and monsoon or nature and culture, if the older ideas of thinking about zoning, like drawing out different kinds of zones and demarcating territories, it hits out at that idea of zone. How is one to start as a spatial thinker to think in terms of zones in newer kinds of ways if we are disturbing older ways of thinking about zones? And you kind of drew our attention to a map, and although you kind of you pointed out that the engaging with the monsoon becomes a multi-scalar and multi-temporal activity, if architects have to grapple with this spatial thinking in terms of thinking about zones, territories, how would they start thinking about it? That's one. Like, I'm thinking about how would I kind of be thinking about this question. That's one thing. The second very powerful proposition of your monsoon as assemblages makes is that it opens out the idea of weave between society and nature, between nature and culture. Weave becomes a very powerful metaphor to think through how monsoon weaves into life, into urban life, society. And the two methods that, the two methodological tropes or the strategies through which you all work, cartography and ethnography. So while you were showing some of the work, cartographic mapping in the three cities and what structures the monsoon, what stood out for me was that the terms that you used, for instance, sedimentation in Dhaka, in Yangon, it was the tectonic shifts and the depression of the clouds in Chennai. These are metaphors through, they're not simply processes, but they allow us to think spatially. They're also spatial metaphors of what this does. Whereas in thinking about the ethnographic work, you opened out two things, which is one of multi-sited ethnography and more than human, mapping not only human, but more than human life. And I'm wondering if form and process gets opened out in one, in cartographic thinking, in multi-sited ethnography and looking at more than human life, are there clues to thinking about forms of life that emerge? And is there a connection to be developed between both of these? For instance, architects historically, I mean, in very different ways and in perhaps very limited ways. For instance, if one looks at the Japanese metabolists, started thinking of drawing on nature and mimicking it to replant. In this change, in this methodological change that you propose, how does one start thinking through nature and society as they weave into one another? Is there a language of spatial thinking? Is there a conceptual language that emerges that architects can draw upon? Is my second, if you could talk a little bit about it. The third thing that I kind of come up to is that while you opened out this talk historically and located certain historical changes and how things are changing in contemporary times, you locate 2 points. One is the colonial processes and now neoliberal processes. But in thinking about the assemblages that monsoon and urban life produces, when actually one dips down into cities, can these two meta processes be held as the major forces of change? Or when one dips down into cities, there may be many other forces that are actually at play, which weave into one another. For instance, yes, I mean, like in Chennai, flooding does take place. It does take place in Bombay, but along with other flooding, it's in Bombay, it is the leakage that takes place in your apartments or any other form of building that becomes one of the things to respond to. And practices of spatial thinking, they may be architects, they may not be architects, respond to that form of the way in which the monsoon engages with everyday life. So what might be the other forces beyond the global colonial and neoliberal forces that one might, or at what scales might one think of when one dips down into the monsoonal volume that also comprises of cities at large. That was my third point. And I'm really drawn to the ways in which you're thinking about time, which is not only linear, but also cyclical. And as I've thought through my work, where I've been engaging in Mumbai with monsoonal change and how urban life emerges in response to monsoonal change. When one looks at this intersection of linear and cyclical time, it is not as if in the cyclical time one returns back to the same moment in time, but one has moved somewhere else. And how might one think through this shift that is taking place? How might one think through temporalities of life itself? Because you opened out again the temporalities of geological time, the temporalities of cyclical time and linear time. But when they intersect with one another, how might one think of those relationships? So these are the 4 points that I have to start off this conversation, as we might get in the whole process, questions and comments from our audience. All of y'all are welcome to pose your questions, comments, or suggestions that you may have. You may type them in the chat box, or you may want to raise your hand and we'll invite you to speak over it. So yeah, I'll hand this over to you, Lindsay.
Rohit, those are very challenging questions and very generous questions that I might just lovely to engage with a discussion with you about. I'm not sure I can answer them all with that much certainty. The first one, based the idea of zoning you asked about, and kind of fixing space within rigid containers, which is really what zoning does, is that zones are measurements, zones are based on lines, zones are delineations, and they also then get associated with certain kind of legal regimes. So I don't think you can separate the zone from the kind of regulatory or legal regime within which it's contained. And, one can understand, and then that gets related to kind of real estate and private property. So there's a whole kind of system of relating to the earth that I think is contained in the idea of zone. And it's based on the earth. It's not based on the sea or the sky, which don't operate in those kind of ways at all. And so what we try to do with I put it like this, human bodies, a very small percentage of them are on the earth, the bottom of our feet, essentially, live on the earth. The rest of our bodies live in the air, live in the atmosphere, which operate not according to zones and lines and boundaries, but according to gradients and thresholds. So I think there's another whole spatial language that if we think about how weather works and the spatiality of weather, I think there are a whole lot of other terms that can allow us to think architecture anyway differently. And that's through ideas of gradient and through ideas of how do you design gradients? How do you design flow? I don't know. Quite frankly, I don't know how city planners would use those ideas in terms of zoning, but maybe they can be useful there too, So that's my answer to the first one, that there are terms from thermodynamics and from hydrodynamics that I think become very useful tools, as kind of ways of pushing back against the kind of legalistic boundary the kind of bounded ideas of territory. You know, the idea of territory that we in the West, the oldest story we tell about it, as Michael Serres says, is territory emerged dripping wet, okay, from the annual cycle of flooding of the Nile Valley, okay, which wiped out properties every year. And then the kind of geometricians, the measurers, had to come back and reinstitute property boundaries every year. So property was never permanent, but tied up with monsoonal cycles, which I found extraordinarily interesting. You then spoke about nature, culture, and waves. Did you use the word waves, which I just thought
I used the word weave.
Wave, yeah. And it's a beautiful idea. And I've only just begun to think about this because I've recently read an essay in a little book called The Glossary of Weather Terms, in which somebody wrote about waves and pointed out that the entire earth is made up of waves. Even our bodies are made up of waves. And waves become a very new way to think about materiality, I think, you know, and that actually waves cross boundaries. You know, our bodies are not delimited, bounded entities, but they also kind of breathe and kind of, you know, that actually, you know, waves are an ontological condition of way more than we think, essentially. Cartography and ethnography, yes, you're right. You know, sedimentation, tectonics, and depressions are indeed, they're both material processes, but they're also ways, they're also metaphors, okay, for thinking about how material processes are tied kind of with human settlements, actually. And we used these terms as a sort of methodological tool of air, water, and ground, you know, air of which we associated with Chennai, water with Dhaka, and ground with Yangon. And then we actually started to interpret those three places' economics through those metaphors. You know, Chennai's economy is based on the IT corridor. IT is reliant on electromagnetic waves, so it's a kind of aerial economy. Obviously, it's got kind of hardcore, you know, hardware and buildings and all the rest of it, but essentially IT is aerial in its conduction. Dhaka is such a, you know, Dhaka's existence relies on its relationships with water, with sediment, with aquifers, with rain. And Yangon, in our reading of it, was a city that was really tied to geology and extractive processes. So they became metaphors through which to read the kind of political economy of the city. Your comments about ethnographic work, which I wasn't that clear on, so maybe we can talk about that again. But, you know, I think I'm not talking about biomimicry here, you know, like let's mimic the monsoonal processes to think about architecture. Not at all, you know. And I think the word that I'm looking for is symbiogenesis, okay, which is a word drawn from systems theory, which talks about symbiotic or mutually reinforcing relations between, you know, between different entities. So in this case, probably between, you know, how does architecture become symbiotic with its weather world? Rather than, you know, architecture historically has been about modifying the environment, okay, which has ended up with, you know, extreme separations between interior and exterior. And I think we need to look at much more symbiotic relationships between interior and exterior, which becomes an architectural project, actually, at multiple scales, as you rightly point out, which is a fantastic thing to remind ourselves of. At the scale of the facade, one can think about symbiosis. And finally, based in the wonderful city that you are in, you talked about what scales. And here I'm reminded of the wonderful project of Nikhil Anand's, which I'm sure you know, the kind of sea project that he's running at UPenn, which really looks at the monsoon at the level of the building, at the level of the kind of seafront, at very, very local scales. And as I said, if I have one criticism of our work, we never got down to that kind of local scale, and we never really pushed, we never tested whether, thinking at a local scale would accommodate the idea that in order to understand the local, you have to zoom right out, okay, to a planetary scale, and zoom right in to a microscopic scale. And that's what I'm trying to do with Ennor Creek, actually, to understand this creek in terms of its wider global extractive geographies, in terms of its planetary and geological extensions, but also in terms of the kind of microscopic chemical effect of toxicity on people's bodies.
Wow, wonderful, wonderful. Thanks. Those were really lovely responses. And I've engaged very closely in the Inhabited Sea project with Nikhil.
Oh, good.
Yes.
That's right, its name. Sorry, I forgot it was the Inhabited Sea. Yeah, wonderful project. Yeah.
So I'd love to talk to you a little more about it sometime later. I'll open up the conversation to the audience. If anybody has comments, questions, interjections to make, you could type in or raise your hand. Wait for maybe a minute.
Maybe a minute, yeah.
And in that 1 minute, so talk a little bit about our work, while engaging with built form. And for me, I was participating in that project with Nikhil and all other colleagues at the Inhabited Sea. And there were two entry points into the project for me. One was that much of the design thinking emerges from geographical information systems and what might be a dense information system that is able to move beyond the geographical information systems, which are very bounded and create clear boundaries. The second was, if you've been living in Mumbai and you venture out into the monsoon on the streets, in the autos, in the buses, or even in the trains, you would hear people talking about monsoon in particular ways in all of these places. In the several conversations I can, I'm reminded of. Won't get into that, but we wanted to hear, me and my colleagues who were working together, we wanted to hear how do households talk about their experience of the monsoon and how do they respond and innovate to monsoon's everyday wetness and its extreme events, and not to see the extreme event and the everyday as two separate things, but things that weave into one another. And what emerged in this inquiry, as we listened very closely to people, was that we realized we were engaging with listening to their oral histories. It's not something that we planned. It emerged as a method that we were documenting households, and through the households, we were documenting around 50 years of the transformation of the neighborhood, not only of the house that they lived in, but also of the neighborhood. And as we heard what they were saying very closely, foliation and exfoliation emerged as a metaphor, not as a metaphor, as an analogy to think about both life and build form. In that sense, cartography and ethnography started kind of coming together as through the analogy of exfoliation. So that's where I was kind of getting at. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. So I'll talk to you about it at some point in time. So
that's amazing.
So that's where our entry points were. So we have somebody who's raised a hand. I'm going to draw that person. Rupali is here, and Rupali would like to ask a question. Dipti, can you let Rupali in as a panelist, please? Hi, Rupali.
Hi, Lindsay.
Hello.
So much for this wonderful, very, very rich conversation. So I just want to say, what is wonderful is the way you kind of speak about this idea of drawing as a way of thinking, right? This is kind of thinking of drawing as a language, and what are new ways of drawing, which in some ways are also new ways of knowing. And then you kind of, you had these two, you had the cartographic, which was really looking at the idea of drawing out volume. And then you had the ethnographic. I'm just kind of also in that sense reminded of some of the drawings that we came across recently, which were folk drawings, folk drawings that in some ways collapsed. They were not cartographic in any ways, and they were really about life worlds and sort of, so it was the ethnographic and a kind of dimension of drawing out space, which is through the idea of narratives, where the idea of human, non-human worlds mix up, the idea of territory gets mixed up, there's no sense of property, and all of these become in some ways rich stories, right? So I'm just wondering if those can also be other ways of drawing that architects kind of also start engaging with, because we've somehow inherited cartography as a way of thinking of drawing, and then sort of opening that up. But maybe in some ways there are other ways of thinking of drawing that collapse some of these dimensions. So yeah, just a suggestion, but I think it's very, very important, I think, as architects to think of what are our new languages of thinking and knowing. So yeah, thank you so much for that.
I think that's so important, that it really is about developing new way. I love what you said. The way we draw is the way we think. It does frame the way that we actually think about the world. And those folk narrative and folk drawings have huge value. We were interested in using climate data, okay, which leads to a certain type of drawing. But I think that's not where it stops. Right. And I do think that also in the field, we often asked people to draw. So we have a whole lot of drawings that, people did for us. But I do think the richness of those kind of cosmologies that one draws from kind of folk drawings and folk literature is really, really important. And what can architects learn from that? Once again, one doesn't want to be extractive, but there's a huge richness of other ways of knowing, which were able to bring together space, time, nature, culture in very different ways. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And look, I always felt that those drawings are maps, and the division between cartography and ethnography, we had to find a way to bring together. So it was carto-ethnography. So what does that mean? We didn't get there. Okay.
Right. Thanks so much. Really.
But I also wanted to say that we shouldn't kind of dismiss GIS as a very powerful political tool. you know, and kind of citizens mapping using GIS is really important in kind of mapping in all sorts of ways. So there's a sort of activist use of that medium as well that shouldn't be thrown out.
Right. Just because you mentioned GIS, I'm just kind of also thinking of how property works in many cases on the ground. And you looked at the case of Dhaka, but also very similar kind of landscape in West Bengal that we did some work in, and where it was very interesting to see that the same plot of land was in some ways owned by completely different. Owned is a very limited term. It was claimed in some ways by completely different kinds of people. So the same land would be claimed by the fisher folk, but the same land would then later be claimed by the, by the people who were farming on it. And sometimes what GIS does is that it kind of limits this understanding of through the kind of lens of ownership. But land has been claimed in multiple very, very complex ways through all kinds of arrangements, all kinds of compensations, relationships, negotiations, and so I think that kind of it's very important to also kind of know what it does, the political dimensions of what some of these technologies do, to the drawing out of things. So yeah, but I think
and what they obliterate, right? And what they obliterate, what they render invisible.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
We have two questions. One is from an anonymous attendee who asks, "Hi, as an architect, do you have any references of architectural practices that approximate a cosmological sensibility such as yours?" So that's a question to you. So that's the first one. The second one is by Aditya Boite, who asks, "It was wonderful how you spoke about your experience right from the beginning and ways of how your research emerged you to produce the question and phrase, how do people approach weather, through rituals, cultures, and activities of the zone. I'm fascinated by some points you spoke about. For monsoon, past is never past and present has never come. And monsoon provides grounds to produce uncertainties." So that's a comment. Thank you for this fulfilling conversation. Yeah. So those are.
All right. Thank you. What lovely comments. Thanks so much to the last person. I appreciate that a lot. I must tell you, I was quite nervous to give this talk to people for whom the monsoon is such a lived reality. It's very different when I talk about the monsoon in Belgium or, somewhere else. But, and it's good to know that it's found some kind of resonance with you. That's really very valuable to me. But in answer to the first question, I can thoroughly recommend a little book to all of you architects in the audience. It's called Flourish. And it's online. You can download it online. And it's called Design Strategies or Design Parameters for the Planetary Emergency. It's by Sarah Ichioka, who comes from Singapore, and Michael Paulin, who's from the UK. And it really presents a kind of regenerative paradigm for design thinking. And actually, Rohit, it takes me back to one of your questions that I didn't answer, your comment that the cycle never comes back on itself. Okay. And in this book, they talk about helical time, so it's like a helix. It kind of comes back, but it never comes back quite to the same spot. Okay, so there's a sort of chronology and then this helix that winds up around it, which to me is a much more accurate way of thinking about the monsoon as a cycle, which never comes back to the same place, So, are there any examples? I mean, I think in that lovely little book, Flourish, Sarah and Michael do really kind of give us examples of people, architects who are thinking in this way. it's a very, I think it's a very important book, actually. We can't hear you, Rohit. You're on mute.
Yeah, so we have another question by the anonymous attendee. Can you speak about your experience with the sensorial limits of methods in studying and writing about the monsoon? For instance, can we think of methods as monsoon? Can it leak, evaporate, and flood as it writes and draws out monsoon assemblages?
Oh, I love that. I'll take that away with me. Yes, of course it can. Of course it can. And, you know, one of the things we tried to do, not very successfully, was to actually use those monsoonal methods as ways of making drawings. You know, flooding paper, letting water seep through paper. You know, there are a lot of experiments that one could do with monsoonal methods, I think, to actually make drawings, you know. So that's a great project. It wasn't our project, but it's a really good idea. Yeah. So that the actual method of thinking becomes monsoonal through the very acts of making.
Thanks. I hope that answers your question. It would be nice to kind of, you know, if you want to ask any further questions, we'll draw you as a panelist if you would like to join me to ask further questions. So are there any other comments, questions? Well, I think there are none, and
that's fine.
That's
good. We've had very rich questions that I'll take away with me, Rohit. So thank you so much.
It was a really lovely talk. It was a very rich talk, and a lot for us to think about through the work that you all have already done. And we look forward to reading your book and also hearing more about your new work that is shaping up in Chennai. We'll keep in touch with you to hear more about it and to engage you in conversations further as we go from here. Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you for joining us. That was a really rich and lovely talk. This was the second lecture, the second conversation of C Conversation Series 2022. Our next, the third conversation will be on 15 July 2022. We'll keep you posted by uploading our posters and announcements on various forms of social media. So thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Shama Foundation and Urban Center for supporting this series of C Conversations. And I thank all my colleagues who've been involved in setting this wonderful series of conversations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and goodbye, everyone. That was really great.
Yeah.